Thank you for joining us tonight for another night of the 19th Annual Spring Literary Festival here at Western Carolina University. My name is Jeremy Jones, and I'm the director of the festival. And tonight, we're so glad to have with us the writer Chantel Acevedo. Before we start, though, a few quick announcements. One, if you were here in person, you would have a chance to go outside and buy some books after the event tonight. But since we're not, if you're watching this on YouTube and you look down below into the comments, you'll see a link to buy Chantel's books over at City Lights, our great independent bookstore here in Sylva, North Carolina. The other thing is, throughout the conversation on YouTube, you can post questions. So when they pop into your head, go ahead and post them in there. And then at the end, we'll bring some of those questions to her. And lastly, at the very end, you'll get a link to a survey. If you can give us some information, we'd really appreciate that. If you're a student and you want those Degree Plus points, you'll get the QR code at the end. So tonight we have some sponsors to thank. The Spring Literary Festival receives support from the North Carolina Arts Council, a division of the North Carolina Department of Cultural Resources. And tonight's event is especially funded by a grant from South Arts in partnership with the National Endowment for the Arts. This project was also made possible by funding from the North Carolina Humanities Council, a statewide nonprofit and affiliate of the National Endowment for the Humanities. And finally, the festival relies on support from the 2020-21 WCU campus team, the Office of the Provost, the College of Arts and Sciences, and the English department. As I said already, tonight's guest is Chantel Acevedo, who's the author of Love and Ghost Stories, the winner of the Latino International Book Award, A Falling Star, winner of the Doris Backwin Award, The Distant Marvels, which was a finalist for the Andrew Carnegie Medal for Excellence in Fiction, and most recently, The Living Infinite. MUSE SQUAD, The Cassandra Curse, was the first book in her new middle grade duology. It was published last summer, and the second book is out in July. And it's called MUSE SQUAD, The Mystery of the 10th. She is a professor of English at the University of Miami, where she also directs the MFA program. And tonight, she's here with us, and we're so grateful to have her. Chantel Acevedo.
Jeremy, thank you so much for that beautiful introduction, and I've had such fun being part of the festival and all the different events this week, so thank you for inviting me. It's been wonderful to kind of escape a little bit during that pandemic, even though I'm still in my bedroom here in Miami. So thank you for that, and thank you for all of you who are tuned in and watching today. As you heard Jeremy say, I've written a number of books, and I'm going to be talking about my most recent adult novel today, The Living Infinite. And here's the requisite book lift. This is my most recent book for adults, and my work has largely been historical in nature, the adult work. My heritage is Cuban American, my parents are Cuban, and I was raised here in Miami. And so the stories that I tend to research and write about tell the stories of Cubans and Cuban Americans and people on the island and here in the United States. It's my interest, and I don't imagine that interest going away anytime soon, but it's where I've been living sort of in my head creatively for a very long time. So what I want to do tonight is just talk to you a little bit about how The Living Infinite came to be, and just read just a little bit. I'm a big fan of not reading too much from work, especially fiction. It can be hard to listen to sometimes. And I believe there are some questions and a game that we're going to play and other fun stuff. So I'll get started. The Living Infinite, the idea for this came to me when I was at a dinner party. I had already written The Distant Marvels, and I'll show you that book. And The Distant Marvels came out in 2015, and it's set during Cuba's War of Independence from Spain. So it's set in the 1890s. And that war was a very long war. It was 30 years, right? So here in the US, we think of it as the Spanish-American War, and the Americans were only involved for a few months, but the Cubans were battling the Spanish for many decades. And so that novel is set during that time. But I wasn't done thinking about it. And so fast forward to this dinner party, and a colleague of mine tells the story of this princess, this Spanish princess. Her name was Eulalia, and she visited Cuba during this war. And so I was immediately intrigued, having written a book about this war. And never having heard of this princess. So I already also felt a little bit of like research guilt, like how did I not know about her? And so she comes to Cuba in 1893 and arrives in Havana Harbor with her husband, and she's on this tour, right? She's been sent by Spain as an ambassador of Spain during a war, and she goes to Cuba, Puerto Rico, eventually DC, New York, and Chicago for the Columbian Exposition, right? The World's Fair of 1893. But they stop in Cuba. And she is there with her husband. That's who she's on tour with. Her husband is her first cousin, and she despises him. That more on that later. He cheats on her perennially, and she was forced to marry him. But she arrives in Havana Harbor and comes onto the deck, and she is wearing a white dress with sort of a blue sort of scarf or a red scarf around her neck and sort of blue ticking on her hat. And she's essentially in the colors, the red, white, and blue of the Cuban rebel flag. Right. Remember, Cuba here is under colonial rule, and then it would be the Spanish flag, would be the flag. So she comes up in these colors, and it is immediately told by her husband that she cannot wear this, right? That this sends the completely wrong signal to the people. And Eulalia, who secretly had met with Cuban rebels in Madrid and was pro-independence, says to her husband, "It is a woman's prerogative to not change her mind when she selected her outfit for the day." And so it's a beautiful story. She comes to Cuba, and the people somehow, even though she is representative of the crown, she is embraced by the Cubans. They love her. She's a bit of a Princess Diana of her day. And I think people, to some degree, must have sensed that she was partial to their cause. So the novel was born for me in that moment when I heard that story at that dinner table. And I was shocked that I had never heard this story, right? And Eulalia was the only Spanish royal to ever visit Cuba. And I believe maybe the only one who has ever visited Cuba. So that to me was also an interesting story. So when I started to research her fabulous life, I became intrigued by this woman who was a rebel in many ways. She was the youngest daughter of Queen Isabel II and is eventually exiled because she writes a book called The Thread of Life. And in that book, she describes what her feelings on divorce and on women in the workforce and all of these ideas that would have been very radical and that for some people today are still radical. And it gets her exiled. Her nephew, the king, kicks her out of the country, and she lives most of her life in Paris. And so in learning all of this about Eulalia and this very early feminist, I wondered what her life might have been like on that tour, right, that she took, and what might have shaped her particularly during the events of that tour, and what it would have been like if she'd written a book as a much younger woman, because that book, she wrote in her 30s. What if she'd written it in her very early 20s, and how bold might she have been then? And so the novel imagines a book that Eulalia wrote and is trying desperately to get published in the States. And the novel ends at the Columbian Exposition and the World's Fair of 1893, which is also a whole other fascinating story. So Eulalia captured my heart, and she was really my first character that I was writing that was not Cuban, right? She's a Spaniard, but much of the novel is set in Cuba. And it was very interesting to research Cuba in that time again, to return to that well, and to look at that conflict with Spain from another perspective. So that is how The Living Infinite came to be. What I'd like to read two little sections of the book for you. And the first one gives us a glimpse of her voice. And in this little section, she is about to leave Cuba, and she's going to tell us in her voice about her husband and his mistress, who was a historical figure, or an actual person. And we also get in this section a little bit of her feelings about Cuba and the conflict with Spain. Soon, I will be leaving Cuba and heading to New York, to Washington, D.C., and then on to Chicago for the Columbian Exposition. I've heard stories about the many wonders I will see there, including a contraption called a Ferris wheel, which takes one up into the sky to view the city and brings one down again. It is no Eiffel Tower, I'm sure. I'm eager to see it all, but sad to leave this island. They say that it is easy to win over Cuban hearts, and I believe it is true. How else can one explain the kindnesses these people have shown me, even as they war against my country and my family? I have been fed well here, adored here, seen impossible things here. But even so, it feels as if the crown of Spain, in my person, is saluting Cuba for the last time. This visit that Antonio and I are in the midst of making is a farewell. Of this I am sure. Other things are ending too. Recently I discovered a letter among Antonio's papers, directed at him, and full of errors and misspellings. Cielito lindo, it begins, that wayward S at the start of the word, an affront to anyone who has ever read a book. The letter ends with the name Carmela, in a signature that is torpid and brutish. This Carmela, this actress, I've discovered, has a round face and a head of dark curls. In her portraits, of which there are a few, she wears dresses with low necklines and bare arms, and she's all cream-colored skin. In rumors, I've heard her called La Infantona. I've heard that Antonio is taking money to build her a home, a miniature palace where he can keep her like a pet. Each time I find that I cannot breathe when I hear it. If I ever meet this Carmela from Cordova, this actress, I will say to her, take my place if you want it. Be courageous and show your face to the world the way I have always had to do. Behold this platter. Undress me, or dress and lay upon it. I would do it. I swear I would. Thus Spain releases her hold on Cuba. Thus Antonio shakes me off and I him. Carmela writes him letters, so will I write letters, many of them, and they will come together and shake the foundations of Spain so that women in my country will feel the tremors of it and grow bold. So that's my imagining Eulalia's reaction to finding out about this mistress who was a real person and who he sort of depleted Eulalia's finances to pay for her home and her dresses and sort of her lifestyle. After this trip that Eulalia takes, she and Antonio part ways. They don't divorce officially, it's not allowed, but they no longer live together after this trip. So we know that something went down, but we don't know exactly what went down. The novel ends up in, as I said, in Chicago. And when Eulalia got to Chicago, as you can imagine, it's the World's Fair, and it's such a big deal for the U.S. and for the city of Chicago specifically. And the sort of the hoi polloi of Chicago are there to greet her and vet her. And Bertha Palmer of the famous Palmer Hotel decides that she is going to throw a party for Eulalia, and it's going to be the party to end all parties. And Eulalia, who is our hero in the story, did have quite an edge to her. She attended the party for, I think, 10 minutes and then left, and was quoted as saying that she could not be expected to attend an innkeeper's party. This, of course, was a terrible insult to Bertha Palmer, and word soon got out, and the papers of the day are very interesting because they go from excited about Eulalia to just talking about just what a wretch, she is, and she's so stuck up, and why did she come here, and we sort of hate her, and no wonder Cuba's fighting Spain, and right, and so everything that the Spanish crown had hoped would happen because of this visit really didn't, right? The goodwill that they'd hoped would occur just backfired. And it was because Eulalia was her own person and she wasn't taking really direction from anyone. In my novel, I imagine that this is also where she's brought her book in order to try to get it published. The novel opens with a really cruel rejection letter from a Spanish publisher. And so I thought I would just end my reading with the worst rejection anyone could ever receive from an editor, in the hopes that none of you ever get anything like this. And if you do, let me know, because I'm going to fight that person for you. So this is an imagined letter that Eulalia receives, and I based some of the language and the tone of it on reviews that her book, The Thread of Life, received from New York reviewers, the papers here in the United States and especially in New York. A lot of the reaction was, how dare she, right? She's a woman and she has no right to say these things or to hold these opinions, right? And she needs to sort of keep her pretty wealthy mouth shut, was the gist of what those reviews look like. But if you go and search The Thread of Life, it's probably in the library. You're gonna, I think, find in those pages a very liberal voice, a very future thinking voice. It almost reads like it's from the future. And I think someone who most modern people would find very copacetic, with their own views. So this is the terrible, terrible letter that I hope no one ever gets. To Her Royal Highness Eulalia, Infanta of Spain. It has been my honor and duty to give prolonged attention to your reflections. I attach great weight to the work therein, and will always treasure as a compliment that you entrusted your writings to me. For an editor, the question first and foremost in regards to a manuscript should be, do you think well of the project? I lament that I do not. I say, women cannot demand perforce their share in the freedoms afforded to men. This applies, I dare say, even to an infanta of Spain. I say, silence too is an act of moral courage. The celebrity of your person will undoubtedly sell many copies. However, public opinion, which in Spain and all of Europe trammels over logic, will be against you, and in its wake, profitability will soon turn to unhappiness for me, my fellow editors, the bookshop owners, and all who care to sell your little joys and little sorrows to the people. I have no doubt that there is a great deal of truth in what you say, that you have been ringed about by so many limitations which you consider without meaning, and that your democratic inclinations have been achieved without malice. However, if I may be so bold as to offer you advice, I would urge you to be content with hope for the future, and the belief that the traditions we hold dear in civilized Europe, when in dispute with the modern sensibilities of the New World, will win out in the end. Those traditions which you seem determined to cast aside are the sole certainties one can rely upon. I have tried not to abuse the privilege that you have offered me in allowing me to read your story, and I will speak of it to no one. This I promise. But for the advantage and protection not only of my company, but of certain values and principles that I hold to be true, I regret that we will not, today, nor ever, publish this book. Very sincerely yours, an editor-in-chief. And perhaps it's bad luck to, write a book and write that letter at the start of your own book. And I did sort of wonder, am I bringing some, weird karma upon myself here? But no, the book was well received, and I was happy about that. And poor Eulalia, if you have a chance to look her up, she has such a fascinating story that doesn't end with sort of her divorce from Antonio. It just sort of goes on, and she lived to a very old age and was trouble with a capital T, but the good kind of trouble the whole time. And I miss researching her and talking about her. So that's my presentation about The Living Infinite. I hope you all have a chance to read it someday. And happy to answer any questions that you may have.
Well, I have some questions. I mean, I'm really taken with how there was this like moment that you found in history that became the kind of launch pad for the book. And I'm wondering if that was the case with the other books that are set in the past. Is there always like a real thing and you're like, aha, there's something I don't know about this and I need to explore it, or how have those taken shape?
Yeah, largely that's how it happens, and it happens in a couple of pieces, right? So for The Living Infinite, I heard that story at a dinner party, started researching her, stumbled upon a book called La Oveja Negra, or The Black Sheep, and it tells her story. It was published in Spain, and it opens with that book, which is nonfiction, opens with a description of what the nursery was like in the palace, and how they had all of these wet nurses, right? Like wet nurses and backup wet nurses and backups to the backups, and they all came from this little town in Spain called Burgos, and the nursery was right next to this aviary, like this wild, aviary that they had in the palace. And I thought, this is such a wacky setup that they had, and I immediately started thinking, who were the other babies? Because if the royal babies, if there's a wet nurse, that means that woman's had a baby, probably who has that baby with her, right? So there's not just the royal children, Isabel had five, but there were all the Milk brothers and sisters. And in fact, the novel was originally called The Milk Brother because the other voice in the story is that of her milk brother, Tomas, who I've imagined whole cloth. There's no record of the milk siblings, but they certainly existed. So that question of like where the idea comes from, it just comes in pieces, but it always starts with a research, just intrigue, right? About I didn't know anything about this. How did I not know anything about this? And I was a total Hermione, always growing up, and still I, deep down, so I'm like, oh, I need to go read stuff, and it leads to story. It often leads to story.
And
That was
I mean, and like it sounds like to me though, at least with that story, you could research it for years and like still find new material, but at some point it becomes clear to you like here's where I start, here's where I create my own world, or here's where the fiction takes over.
Yeah, that's the danger of writing historical fiction, is that you can research something to death, and I have done that. I've researched so much that now I no longer want to write the thing because I've sort of scratched the itch. So you have to kind of stop at a point where a voice is becoming clear to you, like a character voice is becoming clear. Problems that are not research based problems, but they're life problems, are also forming into story. And I think that's when I stop researching and just dive in, and then go back to the as I need to answer questions.
Well, we're going to have some more questions, both from some students and hopefully from viewers out there. But before we do that, we wanted to play a game. But I've invited a surprise guest for this game. So I'm going to bring in another Miami-based writer, M. Evelina Galang, who is the author of 4 books, 3 novels, a nonfiction book. And she is here to play with us our silly game.
Evelina! Unmute, girl.
I love the Milk Brother title. I love the reading that you did. And I hope I never get that letter from that editor.
No, friend. If you ever do, I'm taking my earrings off and we're going to fight.
Excellent. I count on it. Now I kind of want to get that letter.
Just to see the fight. I mean, is Milk Brother and Milk Sister, is that an actual term? Yeah, I didn't know that. Huh. I've never thought about the ins and outs of wet nurses before.
Right?
This is where novels come from.
This is where babies come from. I mean, wait.
Well, I guess I've missold it a little bit. We're not really going to play a game as much as a kind of multilingual experiment. So I'm so thrilled to have both of you, and since you're writers who are sometimes thinking and writing and speaking in different languages, I have compiled a series of random objects. I in fact discovered there is such a thing as a random object generator online. So I've just found some, and what I'd like to do, I'm thinking of this as a multilingual Rorschach test. I just want to put one of the objects up, and I'd like for you to try to notice when the name of that object comes to mind, what language does it come to mind in, and then maybe we can talk a little bit about all of the names for that thing in these various languages. I'm always taken with just how strange language is and how that can be catalytic, I think, for writers too, especially those writers out there in the world watching. Does that make sense? My made up experiment. Okay. So let's give it a shot here. All right. So again, think about what you hear first in your brain, and then we'll see what's there. Here's number 1. I think.
La cucaracha. La cucaracha.
Oh.
That's not where you wanted to start?
No. Gotcha, nasty.
So in South Carolina, where I lived for a while, they have these palmetto bugs. Have you experienced these before? Which fly and are terrifying in their own kind of way. Okay, I'll move on fast. How about this one?
Oh, I call it a beanie.
I call it a hat.
Just a hat? See,
I'm from Wisconsin. That's what our hats look like.
You just call it a hat? So upstate New York is where my stepdad is from, and he calls it, because they're so close to Canada, he's always called that a toque.
A what?
He calls it a what? A toque? Is that some French related word, or it's just, yeah. What we call that in the South is a toboggan.
Is that right?
Yeah. Not like the sled, but that's the hat, toboggan.
That's interesting. Where's that word come from?
That I don't know.
Toboggan. Yeah, I would want to ride that if it was a toboggan.
Because all right, how about this one?
Oh, Brett's.
Clips. Clips came to my mind.
Clips,
but I grew up with barrettes.
What do you call these in Spanish, Chantel?
Yeah.
What do you say?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, clips.
Clips. We say clips.
Clips. Yeah. Okay, let's see. How about this?
Lipstick.
Yeah, yeah, lipstick.
And now I'm blanking on the Spanish word for lipstick. What does this mean?
I don't know. In Central America, they just call it lapis. I don't know what they call it in
True, that's right.
Miami or Cuba.
Lapis, that makes sense.
Yeah, I'm blanking on it.
I mean, what's it like? So I don't know much about Tagalog, but it feels so I don't know, peripheral to Spanish in a way that I imagine living in Miami.
Right. Well,
It just feels like a whirlwind.
yeah, well, Tagalog, first of all, if you've ever known any of Tagalog speakers who speak in English, you know that they speak incredibly fast. And I think as I was doing my own research in the language and in my own work, I realized it's because we also have like the vowels, like you can have 3 A's in a single word, you know, like, and so the language is super fast. But also the other thing that's really interesting about Tagalog is that because of Spain's occupation in the Philippines, we actually share a lot of the same words that the Spanish have. And we have a lot of languages or a lot of words, and of course I can't think of any of them right now, that we actually have subverted so that the Spaniards wouldn't know what we were actually talking about. But interesting note, we were occupied at the same time that Cuba was. So Cuba is like a brother or sister to us. We are milk brothers, actually.
Full circle.
Conflict brothers.
Yeah,
like
that's
leche,
fascinating.
the word leche as a swear word. Do you guys have that in Spanish?
No, not as a swear word.
It's a swear word in Tagalog, leche.
That's what we should have played, as multilingual swear word game. All right, what about this?
Pushpin.
Yeah.
Not attack.
Oh yeah, attack.
Yeah.
Oh, I pushed
Yeah.
What is a word that just means like thing in like Cuban Spanish? Like if you say get me that thing.
La cosa. La cosa is thing.
Yeah. There's not like a, you know, like in English we have all these like thingamabob or the whatchamacallits, you know what I mean?
Yeah, for sure. Like something that's like a mechanical will be un this is again Cuban Spanish, right? Because Spanish is spoken in so many
Right.
so much variety, and but if it's like mechanical, I might say un tareco. Like it's a tareco. I don't know why where that comes from, but that's what that is.
I have no idea what that is in Tagalog. Don't ask me.
I mean, in Honduras, they will say like chunche. I don't know if this is a word that goes in every other, but it's like give me the thingy, chunche. I don't know where that comes from. I don't know if that transcends to other Spanishes, but okay. How about these guys?
Chinelas.
Chancletas.
Chancletas. It doesn't have to be like a flip flop to be a chancleta. I don't even know what we call these in English. Are they slippers? Slides?
Yeah, they're slippers. They're bedroom slippers. They look like bedroom slippers to me.
Okay. How about this?
In Spanish, bufanda.
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 It doesn't get cold enough for that in the Philippines.
Yeah, I was gonna say, it sounds the same with the toboggan, right? Like that's all right. I think I've got one more for you. I'm starting and ending on unpleasant notes. I'm sorry.
Rata.
Okay, now I want to say ipis, which is cockroach in Tagalog.
Oh.
That was it.
Are there other words for rat in Spanish? I guess that's it.
No, ratón I think is a mouse.
Yeah.
Rata is a rat, I think.
Not
I should have put a pig in here. I feel like there are like thousands of words for pig.
Lechon.
Yeah. So when y'all are writing, you know, I'm thinking of again the sort of swirl of languages that sometimes are like echoes, and especially you, Chantel, when you're like bringing in Spanish, like does that happen organically, or are you kind of thinking about that, you know, as you go along?
It is organically, and it is organically, and it's interesting sometimes reading. You know, Evelina and I teach in a multilingual program, and it's interesting students who themselves are bilingual or multilingual when they try to braid other languages. You can tell when it's clunky. But there's a bit of a sort of linguistic science too. Like what are better words to translate, and what are the ones that maybe you should just leave alone. Right?
And is it about sound, or what do you think? Like
it's sound. Sometimes it's just the clarity of the line. If the line is bilingual or multilingual anyway, like what affords the most context clues, right? Now some people aren't writing with that purpose at all, right? Like they're writing, exclusively to one audience, and so they're not so worried about it. But it can be really tricky. I don't know if Evelyn, if you notice sometimes when you're reading stuff that's grading languages, like you can tell when
right.
Yeah.
Right. I always like to think about the musicality of the line, right? First of all, and then usually when the other language, and that would be Tagalog for me, and even sometimes Spanish, it has to do with dialogue and what's coming out of my characters now, and how would they say it. Some words don't translate into English very well, and then oftentimes, and we've been working on that and I've seen some really beautiful things from my students' work where they're writing in context, and there is no direct translation, but you can tell from the way a character responds, or you can tell from the non-answer that's given, or what the language is. And also sometimes you don't have to know what the word means. That's something that we talk about, because for me, so often it's about kind of like that organic, Chantel's talking about how it's organic. It's how the story comes out organically. And so sometimes it's going to have like words in there that are not straight up English. And those are the only words that are going to convey the emotional content of a piece. So, it's like singing.
Mm-hmm.
And when you speak, I'm afforded the opportunity here in Miami to speak bilingually all the time, and like Spanglish all the time. And it starts to develop its own rules of how it's applied. So like I could be talking to Evelina and say, pero like I was talking to one of these students and he was, pero mira, like super, like, obstinate. And like certain words are just automatically going to come out in Spanish and some are going to be in English.
Yeah.
And I just want to make sure you understand.
Right, we call it Taglish, but I got to say something. So my husband listens to me talk to Chantel, and he said that I take on the Miami girl accent when I talk to Chantel, that all of a sudden the way I speak changes. And then there's something else going on there, like linguistically.
He's from West Virginia, so I don't know.
Well, I mean, what does he sound like if he calls back to West Virginia? Like I remember I'm from North Carolina, but I worked unfortunately hard to make sure I didn't sound that way when I went to college. But even when I would call home from other places to my grandparents, my wife would say, I knew who you were talking to, because suddenly like my accent is back,
His voice gets higher and things start to sound like a question, everything's a question. And and it goes about an octave up. So I have a much lower voice at that moment. We joke around about Gomer Pyle.
I just wonder how it makes, you think about language maybe in a more expansive way when you're thinking about multiple languages, or kind of moving through multiple languages as a writer, both in your day-to-day life, but also on the page. If it, I don't know, if it affords you a little more nuance in how you're thinking about language and how to deploy it.
I think it gives you more choices, right?
Yeah.
It gives you more choices. So like Spanish, for example, and I suspect Tagalog is similar in this regard. Like our love songs, if you translate them into English, they sound like the cheesiest, most over the top. Like you would never actually say these things in English to anyone, right? They would, they're just too much. But in Spanish, it's people commonly call each other my my king and my queen and my sky. You're my sky, and you're my beautiful sky. In fact, when I read Cielito Lindo, like you're my beautiful sky. Can you imagine saying that to somebody? You're my beautiful sky. In English, it just sounds like, get out of here. It's so cheesy, right? But in English, we say this to babies. Or in Spanish, we say this to babies. Or, it's the just love language alone, right? Affords you with all of this sort of range of emotion.
Right. Yeah. You got to also wonder, and it's a question, it's not a comment, but like, what is our English, our relationship to English in terms of like when we're speaking? I mean, like the musicality of it or whatever. I mean, I feel like so often when I'm in my English mode and dealing with, English speakers, and I'm American born, so I'm an English speaker, that there's a lot of no nonsense going on. And if anything, if we're playing like playing with voices, but we're not really thinking of like words and using words in the same way. Kind of like that beautiful, like a Spanish. Here comes my husband bringing me a meal, honey. We're on. Look. Hi. Oh, here, the southern voice. Go ahead, say something southern.
How southern you want?
Okay, now go. We're done. He doesn't really talk like that.
He just set the bar for all West Virginians everywhere because he brought you a meal.
That's right. Well, we had a West Virginia writer on the festival last week.
Yeah. Yeah. Who was that?
Misha Marin. Yeah, the novelist. Well, this was a lot of fun. I really appreciate, Evelina, for you come on, surprise Chantel, think about language in some fun ways. This was a lot of fun. Thank you.
Thank you so much for inviting me, and thank you, and enjoy the festival. Chantel was a good pick, wasn't she?
She's great.
Evelina, mahakita.
Mahakita din. Salamat sa'yo. Okay.
Thank you.
Bye.
So we wanted to bring to you a couple of students who have some questions, and they're going to come in just a moment. We have Tamara Olmedo, who's a student in our MA program, and Nico Gonzalez, who's a film student here at Western, and they've got some questions for you. Before they come on, let me just ask one that we've gotten from the audience so far, and that was, how did you come up with a story for the MUSE Squad, Cassandra Curse? Where did that come from?
The MUSE Squad, I've been wanting to write a kidlit. I want to write a book for kids for a while. I taught high school for a long time before I started teaching at the university. I have kids of my own, and they were asking for a book, that they could read. And so I was sort of on the lookout, for a story, and not really just waiting for the right idea to come, And I was on a family vacation in London and at the V&A, which is one of my favorite museums and one of my favorite places anywhere. And my eldest was using the restroom, and I was sort of looking at I was standing by the staircase, and at the end of the staircase is this beautiful bust of a muse. And I went to go take a picture of it. And sort of like a bolt of lightning, I had this idea, which was, what if the muses had been children? And I've never had an idea sort of come completely to me that way, sort of in that kind of lightning bolt way. And so either it was muse given, or I just got incredibly lucky. But I just started writing on my phone, like on the phone app, on the notes app, ideas for who these kids might be and how might muses inspire people differently from an adult evocation of what a muse is. And so that's how MUSE Squad was born.
Thank you. Okay, so here come our interviewers. Nico and Tamara, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
And we're ready for your questions.
Hi, Chantel. First of all, thank you for doing this with us. So my first question, I finished reading The Living Infinite, and I'm in the process of reading The Distant Marvels, and I noticed that you have some really well-developed, strong female characters, and you spoke a little bit about where you got the inspiration for La Infanta Eulalia, but I was wondering about the other characters like Maria Sirena and her mom. Where do you draw from to create these characters? Like, what inspires them?
The Distant Marvels, that idea for that book came from, I was just sort of Googling about the Cuban War of Independence in Spain, realizing I didn't know much about it. I wasn't thinking of a novel that I was going to write. And then I stumbled across these pictures of these emaciated children. And I thought for a moment I had accidentally hopped onto like a Holocaust, a website about the Holocaust or something, and quickly realized that these were pictures of the time, and that Cuba, that Spain had enacted a policy of concentration camps in Cuba during the war, and that these were victims of those camps. They were the reconcentrados. And so that led me to another article that was an American article, sort of bearing witness on the ground about this little boy who had been sold to an American soldier, an American captain. This was after slavery, both in Cuba and in the US. And so that question of that he was exchanged for money sort of stayed with me. And so I started to research who this boy might be. And I couldn't find anything about him. And I spent a long time looking in different archives, and nothing was coming up. And that naturally led to the question of who his parents might have been, and specifically was who his mother might have been. And that's where the idea of Maria Sirena came from. And I'm not giving anything away in the prologue, right? Like we learned this very quickly, that she's lost a son. But the this question of like, who are these women in this war? And it became very present for me in my mind. And when I started researching them, the Mambisas is what they were called, and they were women who went to battle, right? That they fought in the War of Independence alongside the men, and I became fascinated by them. And so in the novel, Maria Sirena, she herself is not a Mambisa, but her mother desperately wants to be one, and she's sort of a child of the war, and sort of a teenager, you know, during the war. And so we get her witness of this war and her story as she moves into adulthood. In terms of sort of specific influences, you know, my family is very matriarchal in many ways, and I think a lot of us have, you know, strong, you know, matriarchs in our family, and I was no exception. My mom, you know, and my dad broke up when I was very, very little, so I lived with my mom and my grandmother and my grandfather, and my grandmother was very much in charge of the household. She was the boss, you know, and even though I lived there with my mom, if I wanted to, you know, go out to a friend's house, my mom would say, go ask your grandmother, right? Like it was like that, you know, like that was like the order of things. And so for me, she was always my model of a strong woman. And there are lots of strong women in my family, and I hope that I'm one too. I don't always succeed, you know, but I aim for, and I hope that I'm raising strong women. So I think about my characters being that as well. Outer strength, inner strength, or strength in all of its patterns and permutations is important for me to explore.
I love that. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, kind of going off of that, you mentioned your background, you know, with your grandmother and your mother. So I'm curious how much of your background personally, your autobiographical elements of your life go into your work, as well as storytelling, how that plays a part in your everyday life.
Sure. I mean, it always creeps in, right? Like the self always creeps in, you know, whether it's a tiny little detail, something that is very true for you or not. Like even in MUSE SQUAD, where Callie finds out she's a muse and she accidentally turns her best friend into a pop star. And she, with her muse powers, of course, it is a magical adventure story. And it creates a rift in her friendship because suddenly her friend is very popular and she is not, right? And so what happens there when your friend starts to outshine you in big ways? And I drew very specifically from my own elementary school friendship. I was best friends with the most beautiful, most popular girl at my school, right? And so all like living and being in her shadow, you know, for all that time, and knowing that it was no fault, that my feelings, right, of feeling inadequate were not her fault at all, you know, those were just, that was my issue that I needed to deal with. And so I remember those feelings very strongly, you know, in the 5th grade and the 6th grade. I drew from that. So the self always, you know, sneaks in, but also the stories of others, you know, are part, I think, of my story as a writer, particularly my first novel, Love and Ghost Letters. I always say is a love letter to my grandmother, because I grew up in a household where she was constantly trying to teach me lessons by telling me stories. And they were stories largely of her own childhood, growing up in Cuba in the 20s and 30s and 40s, and eventually left Cuba in 52. So sort of that era, right? Those years in Cuba were sort of stories of those eras were foundational for me. And so I think of that book, which was my MFA thesis, as a love letter to her. So it was her stories, not my own, right? That made their way into the novel. And A Falling Star tells the story of a dear friend of mine who came in the Mariel boat lift. And it was a story she told me when we were 15 years old. And she came when she was 5. And it was a very dramatic thing that happened to her. She was lost when she arrived here. Like she, as a child, was physically lost and then found. And so she told me that story when I was 15. And in my 30s, I remembered it. And I asked her about it. Was my memory accurate? And she said it was. And I asked her if I could write the story or, you know, riff off the story and be inspired by her story. And she said, of course you can. And so I did. And so it's not always your personal one too, but it's also the stories of those around you, and being like Henry James, a person on whom nothing is lost, you know, and you're a filmmaker, Nico. So, you know, listening to those stories and sort of capturing them, like sort of being a satellite a little bit in the world, is sort of how I've made my way.
So my next question, as a Latina author, and I know in a time where I think now we're starting to see more Latina authors, but it wasn't always the case. So I'm thinking for you, when was the first time that you saw a book that had a character or featured somebody on the cover either or in the storyline that you could actually relate to, that maybe interest?
Yeah, I was in college. I was starting to take creative writing classes, writing stories about my stepdad's family. My mom remarried when I was a teenager, and my stepdad, who I love very much, is a white person from of Irish descent from upstate New York, right? And so his family and his family story seemed to me like the stuff of literature because it was what I was exposed to. Like Granddaddy, who fought in World War II and has a Purple Heart, like that seemed to me like this is literature with a capital L. And I never once considered that I could write about my mom's side of the family, right, or the people and the places I'd grown up. It just did not see. It was not conceivable. I had not imagined it. And so when I was in college, I was in the mall. This was back when the malls had bookstores in them, the golden days, Jeremy. Walden Books and Walden Books, remember those? And I walked one of those guys, and in right there on the shelf, looking at was Christina Garcia's Viewing in Cuban. And if you know that cover, it's a beautiful cover. Like it's almost like a cigar box cover for the and I sort of walked towards it in the daze and opened it, and there were characters that seemed familiar, and there was Spanish on the page, and there was this sprawling story in multiple voices. And my first thought, I'm ashamed to say, was, how'd you get permission to write this? Right? Like, what is this? Yeah, because my ceiling of like possibility was right over my. It was like an inch over my head, and I was like bumping into it without knowing. You know. I read that book, and I remember before reading it, just skimming it in the store, and like Emily Dickinson, you know, like every window in your brain explodes. That quote. It was like that moment of like, what am I doing writing about upstate New York? Like, what am I doing? I could be doing this, you know. It before I even purchased the book, you know, and then I purchased it and read it and was like blown away. And she that book opened doors for me, and in that I discovered that other writers. She wasn't the first, right? She's not the first, you know, Latinx writer at all, but it was like a gateway drug. And suddenly I was like Julia Alvarez and Sandra Cisneros and Gabriel Garcia Marquez, and like it was just like boom, 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 and all of these writers were being made known to me. You know? She sort of pointed the path to walk on. So yeah, when I get asked that question, I love it because I have a very specific answer, for it. It's that book, like that's the book of my soul. And I got to tell Christina Garcia that the first time I met her, and then got all teary-eyed, and I thought she was going to call the cops, but she didn't. And and we've become friends since. So that's been a tremendous gift as well.
Yeah, that's definitely how I feel about digging through, anything having to do with Spanish film, just consuming it like there's no tomorrow, and going back decades and decades, and sort of then going into now the process of it all. When you have discovered these books and they're telling about these cultures, now you get the opportunity to do so. How does that affect the process of you approaching a story, how you tell that story?
You mean in terms of like what they teach me, that kind of thing?
Or like when you sort of read up on an historical figure, or a moment in time, or just a feeling you have about being Cuban American, and when you decide this is a story, how do you then go about approaching the narrative? Like what point of view to tell it from, sort of what the overarching theme is, while also, of course, incorporating the culture in there?
Yeah, well, that's all a slow process, right? Like that's sort of building a world from nothing, right? From the ground up. I often will start with, for me, my adult novels almost nearly have always started with a historical moment, as a writer who's drawn to historical fiction. Like, what is this historical moment? Why does it intrigue me? Why am I interested in this thing that happened, And then I start to populate it, with people, like asking myself, well, who might be sort of vulnerable in that space, or who might be powerful in that space, right? Like those kinds of questions. When I first started writing my first two books, I pantsed my way through it. And I don't know if you've heard of the term, the pantser versus plotters debate that's been going on for a long time among writers, but some writers are pantsers, so they go by the seat of their pants. They just write without knowing how it's going to go, right? They just go. And then the plotters who like plot everything out, right? And there's no right or wrong way. And my first two novels, I pantsed my way through them and wrote myself into a million corners that I had to then write myself out of. And after that second one, I was like, I'm never doing this again. And so for me now, I don't start a book unless I know how it ends. So I just won't even begin it unless I know how that story ends. And that means that my pre-writing process has become super long. So like I'll get an idea for a story and I won't start writing it for like, I'll write like an opening chapter just to get a sense of like the vibe of it, like I'll play with it a little bit, but I won't actually start writing in earnest probably for like another year or two, sometimes 3, because I don't want to start and not know where I'm going. With that story, I want it to feel like it's full of purpose. So that process has evolved for me over time. But once once that comes to you, like once like the fullness of the idea is there, that's a really satisfying thing. And then the drafting goes quick because I know where I'm going as well. I'm not sure if that answers your question.
Oh, totally. I relate in that. It seems like the older I get and the more experience I get, whether it be writing or making any kind of art, the more sort of cautious I am about approaching something, because you kind of almost feel like you have one shot at it and you want to do it justice and you want to give it, 100% of the effort. So that's completely understandable.
What do we have? Okay. You spoke a little bit about the Spanish and how when to include and how much to include. Do you ever worry that by including Spanish, you're alienating the readers that don't understand? Like, how do you determine what to include and what not to include in terms of language, I guess?
I mean, my purpose is never including Spanish. It's never to exclude anyone, right? Like I don't do it so that you too will feel what it feels like to not understand the language. You know what I mean? Like I'm not doing it politically, I'm doing it because for the characters that I write and for the worlds that I'm bringing to the page, that's verisimilitude, right? Like that is approximating reality, because I don't write in Spanish. What I need to do is but most of my characters are speaking in Spanish. I need to evoke Spanish on the page, right? Through English and through the use of Spanish words as they're braided into the text. So I don't sort of, again, write with the purpose to sort of obfuscate, right? I don't. I write for clarity, because my characters in the stories are paramount. But I also know that if they're going to feel real, if they're going to feel Cuban, right, the Spanish has to be a part of it, So it's both organic, as we mentioned in the last little segment, with Evelina, that it's organic choices for which words get translated. But there's a little bit of a science to it as well, so that you're not alienating readers. Now, do I care if someone picks up my book and sees Spanish and goes, I don't like that, or I wish they'd not used it? I don't particularly care. That book is not for them, right? So, and you can't write for everyone anyway. Like every book is going to have its critics, and it's going to have people who were bored by it or disinterested, or they didn't like the topic. And if the fact of Spanish existing in the book is what turns someone off, well, maybe it's better if they don't read my work. You know what I mean? And please don't tell me that that's your feeling about it, because I'm not going to want to know you, right? Like that you're closed off, to the possibilities of other languages that way. I think it's wonderful practice for everyone to read books that are graded with other languages, even when it is hard, right? Even when even when you're reading and you know that you're being excluded, right? In some moments, I think a beautiful example of this is, and you, Nico, you'll know this because you're big into film. That movie, The Whale Rider. Do you remember when that movie came out years ago? It's a beautiful movie. Well, it was a novel first. People don't all know this here in the United States. In New Zealand, they certainly do. By Witi Himaira. And if you can get your hands on a New Zealand version of that book, not an American version, because the Americans translated it, but if you can get your hands on a New Zealand edition of that book, it's written both in Maori and in English. And when the whales are speaking, they're speaking in Maori. And you will read those chapters if you don't speak Maori, you're not going to get it. But to me, it was such a beautiful transformational thing to read it, right? To read it and not know, but to know that this is an essential moment in the book. And I think it's just good practice. I think it just opens up your heart and your mind to the possibilities of language. And so that would be my recommendation for anyone who hasn't ever read something that's multilingual or bilingual. Like give it a go and just give yourself over to it.
Well, Tamara and Nico, thank you so much for these great questions and for coming on and taking part.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you, Chantel. Thank you, Jeremy.
Yeah, thank you. Well, with our last bit of time, I kind of wanted to go back to this this idea you were talking about of sitting with a novel idea for a year or more. And I'm trying to decide, does that take a lot of faith in your process? And if so, how did you get there? Like, to me, it feels terrifying. Like you were saying, it would feel terrifying to start too early, but to me, like, I don't know. Do you have like 8 of these like logged and ready, locked and loaded for future, or is it always like one project you're holding on to?
I don't have that much brain power, you know. It's hard enough to think about one, you know, that's not quite ready and you're trying to get it there. I think there's a lot of pressure when you're younger and you first start publishing, you know, where your editor, you have an option book and your editor's waiting for the next one, you know. It's like, well, what's the next one? And I think when you first start publishing, you try to get them the next one, you know. So the second book I actually wrote was a total, like it just never made it off of my agent's desk, you know. She was like, well, it's not very good, you know. But I felt that incredible pressure to like, well, follow up Love and Ghost Letters, St. Martin's has the option, write the next thing, you know. And it was terrible. It was terrible, you know. And I think I attempted a third book, which was, I never finished that one, but also it just felt rushed, and I was forcing the matter, you know, there. And I think novels are such commitments of time. They are such big works of art, you know, that you owe it to yourself to make sure that it's the right story to tell, and that you're not just plugging in the pages to tick a box to get it to an editor, right? So you can get that machine going, you know. And unfortunately, most of us can't live off our writing, and I don't. You know, I teach, and that's, you know, my and I'm lucky to have that gig, and that's what, you know, pays the bills and all of that. And I know that's for a lot of people, you know, like that's, especially if they're freelancing or whatever, right? Like they're on the hamster wheel and they can't jump off of it, you know. But if you can, you know, like I think a lot of that pressure is largely we manufacture it for ourselves, you know, and it's in our own heads, right? Like I gotta publish the next one, I gotta publish the next one. And I think it's, as I've gotten older, it's easier to let it go. But I know it's hard when especially when you're first starting out. So, and certainly I feel it a little bit with the Kidlit stuff, because that's I'm almost like a debut writer. Like I'm a debut in Kidlit, you know, so that also feels like you get that question about like, when's the next one coming? And so that pressure starts to build. But yeah, I feel like knowing, especially with the Distant Marvels and the Living Infinite, knowing how those stories ended, the writing of it was so much more pleasurable, you know, that I've just given myself that gift of figuring it out before I get started.
Well, then I know that you've got a book coming out in July, so this is almost a rude question to ask, but can you say then what you're working on now, or what's at least kind of ruminating up there?
Two things. So I've got another book under contract. It's another middle grade book, not a series, it's a standalone, and that's very fun to write. And it's the announcement's not been made, but it's a lightly spooky, you know, story. So I'm excited about. I'm physically working on that one, but I've got an adult book that is one of those that have been, I think 2 years now, has been in cooking, you know, for 2 years, and I've got a good quarter of it done at this point, and I know how it ends, and I know the characters, and so that has been a real joy to slip back into that voice, to slip back into historical fiction, right? To be doing that work again. But yeah, it was cooking for a long time, or it felt like a long time.
Well, we appreciate you cooking with us tonight. Thanks for sharing your work, for playing our games, for answering our questions. We really appreciate you being here with us, and are looking forward to whatever comes next.
Thank you so much. This was so fun, Jeremy. Thank you.
Yeah. So everyone else, tomorrow evening we'll be back with the writer Jeff Charlotte, and if you're on campus, we'll be at the picnic area tomorrow at 5 for Reading with Jesse Graves and the winners of our writing competition. And I will give everyone one more chance, if you have a chance, to fill out our survey or to click the QR code to get your degree plus points. Otherwise, thanks so much again to Chantel Acevedo, and I hope to see everyone here tomorrow night.
Thank you all.